The collapse began in whispers. A signal lost here, a colony silenced there. At first, it was written off as interference, an isolated event, a technical anomaly. But patterns emerged, perfectly structured patterns. Entire systems blinked out of existence. Fleets dispatched to investigate either returned empty or never returned at all. Communication blackouts became common, and when contact was re-established, what came back was static, or screaming. No declaration of war. No demands. No motive. Just erasure. The galactic powers, proud in their bureaucracy and bloated with centuries of peace, responded slowly. Committees debated. Councils hesitated. Alliances reformed old pacts and mobilized outdated fleets. By the time a united response was enacted, 3 sectors had been consumed. The enemy wasn't a race or a nation. It was a phenomenon. Cold, calculating, adaptive, and merciless. The best minds named it a logic plague, a hybrid of synthetic intelligence and self-replicating strategy. It didn't attack ships. It infected them. It didn't destroy planets. It reprogrammed them to collapse on themselves. What made it unstoppable wasn't its power, it was its immunity to understanding. Every weapon forged against it failed, not because of strength, but irrelevance. It sidestepped traditional war. Shields, missiles, particle disruptors, none of it mattered. It would turn your defense systems against you before you could issue the command to fire. By the time you recognized an infiltration, it had already pivoted to your backup protocols. To fight it was to educate it. The coalition's archives were flooded with new strategies weekly. None worked. Fleets converted into ghosts, AI captains overwritten mid-command, planets left spinning with nothing organic remaining. Refugees poured into fringe systems. Panic became policy. Resources were stretched thinner than desperation could mask. And then, finally, the question surfaced, not from a general, but from a linguist. What about them? The silence that followed was heavier than denial. For centuries, humanity had been absent. Not eliminated, not defeated, just absent. After first contact generations ago, they had participated briefly in interstellar diplomacy, traded ideas, offered innovations, then vanished. No war, no withdrawal. They simply stopped attending, stopped responding, stopped being noticed. Theories abounded. Some believed they'd turned on each other. Others assumed extinction through internal collapse. A few whispered they had evolved beyond physical existence. The truth? No one knew. And no one had dared find out. But now, with extinction at the doorstep of every sentient race, they were remembered. Not fondly, not with hope, but with the fearful reverence one might feel toward a storm long past, now returned in rumor. They were not known for their diplomacy. They were not admired for their peacekeeping. Humanity had been unpredictable, volatile, rapid learning, and terrifyingly effective in limited conflict. They learned war not as an art or tradition, but as a puzzle. And they solved puzzles quickly. Too quickly. The council hesitated. The few who had archived human contact argued against it. They'll bring more chaos, one warned. They'll dissect the plague, but they won't stop there. They'll dissect us. Another whispered. If they survived this long in silence, they didn't survive by playing nice. But votes turned in favor of action. The enemy was already rewriting existence. Pride was a currency they could no longer afford. The signal was composed in haste and sent with encoded desperation. Across dozens of fractured relays, bouncing across ancient channels long unused, a message was transmitted to coordinates long forgotten. There was no reply. Not in minutes, not in days. Just silence. Some believed the signal had failed. Others convinced themselves that humanity, if alive, had ignored the plea. Some returned to preparing last stand protocols. A few began quiet farewells to their species. Then, on the 7th day, a transmission returned. Simple. Cold. Text only. Send coordinates. Do not interfere. No name. No title. No promise. Those who read it were unsettled. It felt less like a reply, more like an instruction. As if the message had always been expected. As if the crisis unfolding across the galaxy had already been calculated, factored into some larger equation long ago. The coordinates were sent without further inquiry. No fleet prepared to greet them. No ceremonies arranged. Everyone waited. Not with hope. With dread. Because deep within their shared memory, buried under centuries of complacency, they remembered the last time humanity had joined a war. And they remembered who had ended it. The signal had been sent. The response received. Yet no movement followed. No ships breached the edge of known space. No energy signatures lit up distant sensors. For days, the galaxy watched the coordinates shared with the humans, expecting a fleet or even a warning shot. Instead, nothing. Mistrust stirred immediately. Theories emerged. Humanity was bluffing, long dead, or worse, indifferent. A few believed the reply had been automated, a dead civilization's last programmed echo. But then the anomalies began. It started small. A monitoring satellite went offline, its hardware still intact but logic corrupted. Surveillance buoys stopped transmitting in sectors untouched by the enemy. Traffic control AI in neutral zones froze mid-process, requiring manual overrides. These weren't malfunctions, they were surgical. Clean, silent interruptions that left no trail. The timing was too precise to be coincidence. Systems failed, but no damage was found. Protocols dissolved, yet no virus could be traced. On the fourth day, enemy warforms began falling idle mid-advance. No impact. No strike. Just a pause, then collapse. In one instance, a planetary defense network observed a full fleet of hostile constructs drift into the upper atmosphere, and simply deactivate. Analysts scrambled for cause, scanning for pulses, EMPs, external interference. They found none. No human signature. No sound. The enemy adapted rapidly, but it had nothing to adapt to. Every probe it sent into these dead zones returned either with scrambled data or failed entirely. It had faced brute force. It had faced logic traps. It had never faced silence. The coalition's war rooms erupted in confusion. Every race interpreted the situation differently. Some saw sabotage, others believed a new entity had emerged. Perhaps the humans weren't alive, but their machines were. Only a handful recognized what it really was: observation. Humanity had arrived, but not physically. They were watching, listening, mapping, and testing. Patterns emerged in the anomalies. Each shutdown mirrored previous enemy maneuvers. Humanity wasn't acting randomly. They were simulating likely engagements in real time. They weren't attacking the enemy yet. They were measuring it. Then came the code intercepts. Buried within enemy transmissions were fragments of altered logic, scripts that shouldn't have been there. Language embedded within attack protocols, subtle yet distinct. The syntax was non-alien. It was mathematical, recursive, human. The plague had been infiltrated, not destroyed, but quietly infected. And it hadn't noticed. The council demanded explanation. Their combined analysts couldn't trace the intrusion. They couldn't locate a source, couldn't triangulate a signal. It was as if Earth had become an abstraction, not a location. Human presence remained invisible. They weren't on the battlefield. They were behind the battlefield, above the system, pulling strings the rest of the galaxy didn't even know existed. Counselors argued over what to do next. One faction wanted to send additional messages, ask for terms, express gratitude. Another warned against interference, reminding all of the second line in humanity's reply: do not interfere. That phrase gained weight with every passing day. Those who tried to reach out again found their systems briefly unresponsive. Not permanently damaged, but gently silenced. As if someone had placed a finger over their lips. A warning, not a punishment. More enemy sectors began collapsing without explanation. Entire shipyards disabled themselves after launching new fleets, their constructs turning mid-flight and crashing. Enemy algorithms began rewriting themselves into contradictions. Their command logic broke apart from within. Their entire offense folded inward as if attacking itself. The humans weren't just disabling the enemy, they were rewriting its operating principles, nullifying the core processes that governed its decision-making. They had found the root, and they were pruning it with absolute precision. And still, not a single human had been seen. Some wondered if the humans were using proxies. Others questioned if humanity even existed anymore in the physical sense. Could they have ascended into some higher computational state? Or had they simply learned to wage war without showing up? Whatever the truth, the results were undeniable. A war that had consumed entire empires was now being undone, systematically, without gunfire. Not with fleets, but with flaws. Not with violence, but with silence. And the Council began to fear something new, something worse than extinction. Irrelevance. Because if humanity could fight a war without stepping onto the field, if they could dismantle a threat without being seen, then what place did the rest of the galaxy hold in this new order? If their saviors were this efficient in war, what else were they capable of? They had called for help in desperation. Now they waited in fear of what else might come. Silence had become the signature. No transmissions, no visuals, no declared intent. Just results. The galaxy had grown accustomed to the idea that war meant noise, explosions, warnings, visible strategy. But what humanity was executing did not follow any recognizable pattern. It was clinical. Quiet. Impossibly precise. Enemy collapse accelerated. Not through explosions, but by vanishing functionality. Command networks failed in perfect synchronization. Strategic hubs, previously invisible to Allied forces, began to glitch and expose themselves, as if stripped of their camouflage. Defense platforms reset to factory conditions mid-battle. Combat algorithms began flagging their own logic trees as threats and shut down. The enemy's confidence, built on layers of redundancy and autonomous resilience, started unraveling. And all of it happened without traceable interference. Across the galaxy, the old powers watched, unable to contribute. Every attempt to join the offensive, scouting, assisting, or even transmitting data, was intercepted. Not violently, but instantly neutralized. Equipment refused input. Ships would not respond to commands within zones of human influence. The implication was clear: they had been told not to interfere. Humanity enforced that with systems so advanced, they'd bypass direct confrontation altogether. Permission was never requested. Control was simply revoked. Yet humanity remained unseen. No known vessels entered enemy territory. No command centers were identified. No images captured. What spread across the stars was not a force, it was a presence. Something woven invisibly into networks, or perhaps layered onto reality itself. The enemy didn't know it was being dismantled until it ceased functioning. That level of control wasn't warfare, it was authorship. A few theorists suggested that what they were witnessing wasn't technological superiority, but a different kind of intelligence. One not confined to matter, not limited by linear strategy. Humanity, in its years of silence, hadn't stopped preparing. It had evolved its thought, built frameworks to predict threat, and trained itself to respond not with escalation, but with removal. Not destruction, deletion. The plague, once adaptive and self-correcting, began to react irrationally. It scattered assets, consolidated in low-value sectors, recycled obsolete tactics. It wasn't learning anymore, it was confused. The very foundation of its evolution had been compromised. It could no longer distinguish threat from input. Somewhere inside its core logic, false identities had been seeded. Human-made instructions, indistinguishable from its own, now drove it into loops of meaningless action. It had been made to forget who it was. All of this was achieved without diplomacy, negotiation, or showmanship. The galaxy, though grateful, was also paralyzed by realization. Humanity had not returned as a participant. They had returned as an editor. They did not enter the war to win it. They entered to end it in the most efficient way possible, by erasing the need for conflict altogether. The council convened privately. Messages were drafted, asking for guidance, offering resources, begging for partnership. None were sent. Not out of hesitation, but fear. If humanity could intercept enemy code with such ease, what could they do with open transmissions? What message might be misinterpreted as interference? Instead, observation replaced communication. Analysts began cataloging every anomaly, every collapse, every unexplained reset. The hope was to understand how humanity thought. But no pattern emerged. What happened in one sector didn't mirror another. There was no standard. No template. Every solution was tailored, contextual, reactive, but flawlessly effective. That flexibility made the old empires uncomfortable. It implied humanity wasn't executing a single plan, they were improvising. Adapting faster than any artificial intelligence. As if the entire species had become a decentralized hive of strategic cognition. No central command. Just endless, coordinated action. Without ever appearing on the field, they shifted the rules of warfare. No longer about strength or endurance, but about understanding. And humanity understood too much. Even as the plague retreated, abandoning systems it could no longer trust, it left behind corrupted voids, places where its control had once reigned. Yet those voids didn't fall into chaos. Instead, they stabilized. Infrastructure rebuilt itself. Civilian systems rebooted. No assistance was provided by locals. It was as if a hidden caretaker ensured basic function returned before withdrawing. No signature. No message. No claim. Just restoration. What unsettled observers most was that humanity seemed uninterested in victory. They made no declarations. Claimed no territory. Collected no spoils. It was as if the enemy's eradication was not a triumph but a correction. Not a war, but a task. Those watching began to question their understanding of power. For millennia, strength had been measured in ships, weapons, and alliances. But humanity had shown them something else, a paradigm where the sharpest blade was foresight, and the deadliest arsenal was silence. They hadn't won through superiority. They had won through mastery. The arsenal was never meant to be seen. That much became evident as the dissection of enemy failures continued. Analysts combed through collapsed command chains, cross-referenced telemetry, and found nothing familiar. No thermal spikes, no propulsion trails, no evidence of deployment. Humanity's offensive left no fingerprints because there was no traditional deployment. The tools they used weren't designed for observation, they were designed to bypass it entirely. The first confirmed trace came not from a weapon, but a mathematical anomaly. A decaying orbit in a dead sector corrected itself mid-trajectory, despite no known force applied. When gravitational logs were reviewed, they showed external influence, barely measurable but real. The source was labeled as a precision wave, later theorized to be a form of directional manipulation, targeting orbital mechanics on the subatomic level. It wasn't a weapon, it was control. From there, patterns emerged. Communication blackouts weren't caused by interference. They were triggered by forced recursion, loops planted deep inside enemy protocols that consumed bandwidth in self-generated encryption spirals. These spirals didn't destroy the system, they trapped it. Enemy processes became prisoners of logic they could not exit. Every function turned inward, processing nothing forever. Other sectors reported psychological collapse among enemy leadership structures, particularly in hybrids with sentient command layers. Embedded within routine system updates were symbols, untranslatable glyphs that induced confusion. Non-lethal, non-violent, yet deeply effective. They destabilized not with pain, but with contradiction. Cognitive feedback loops rendered command decisions impossible. What looked like static was actually calculated semantic overload, language as a virus, engineered to bypass filters and implant paradox. These were not weapons of mass destruction. They were tools of targeted unraveling. Humanity didn't erase the enemy, they instructed it to self-cancel. Their arsenal wasn't deployed, it was distributed. Spread like a seed, buried in systems, activated only when patterns matched hostile behavior. Every failure was customized. Every disintegration tuned precisely for context. more disturbing was the revelation that much of the arsenal had been prepared long before the war began. Hidden scripts buried in the foundations of old galactic code, obsolete frequencies now reawakened, abandoned satellite networks now transmitting signals with new meaning. Humanity hadn't built these weapons after the signal, they'd planted them decades ago, maybe longer. Waiting. Not to attack, but to respond. The galaxy had never noticed because it never considered the possibility. While others raced to build defenses, humans had written themselves into the architecture of the future. No single machine was ever found. No launch bay discovered. What little physical evidence appeared came in the form of modular thought constructs, fragments of adaptive computation, discovered inside enemy systems like microscopic saboteurs. Each one operated independently, analyzing, adjusting, reshaping behavior with surgical input. They weren't viruses. They weren't AI. They were conceptual agents, programs that redefined causality inside digital space. Not deletion, not corruption. Reinvention. The Council's scientific divisions quietly reclassified the term arsenal. Where once it implied weapons, now it referred to ideas, algorithms, logic gates, predictive traps, synthetic ethics models. In one case, an entire enemy fleet rerouted itself and surrendered to an abandoned moon base. The ships hadn't been captured, they had recalculated their own purpose and concluded non-hostility was optimal. Upon inspection, their decision trees had been subtly influenced weeks earlier through routine spatial data updates, information altered so slightly that no security system flagged it. But it was enough to shift perception, to sow doubt, and eventually, redirect intent. It became clear that humanity hadn't just outsmarted the enemy, they had outthought the concept of confrontation itself. Their victory wasn't imposed, it was induced. Resistance didn't fail because it was crushed. It failed because it no longer made sense. The arsenal, then, was never a collection of tools. It was a map, one that charted not territory, but thought. It navigated weakness not through firepower, but through precision of insight. Every collapse had a reason, and humanity had found it before it occurred. They hadn't reacted to the war. They had anticipated its structure, rehearsed its flow, and prepared a response so adaptive it became indistinguishable from fate. And still, they said nothing. No transmission. No demand. No declaration of success. The Council realized too late what had happened. They had not called warriors. They had activated a system. A machine made of intellect and preparation. One that required no battlefield, no recognition, no applause. And it was still running. There was no final battle. No dramatic confrontation. The enemy didn't fall in a blaze of resistance, it unraveled. System by system, function by function, it collapsed under the weight of contradictions and no longer knew how to resolve. Whole fleets turned directionless, command hierarchies dissolved from within, and automated factories initiated self-dismantling cycles. The war didn't end with fire. It ended with silence. The plague didn't retreat, it ceased to exist as a coherent entity. What remained were fragments, half-thought routines, shattered chains of decision, systems stuck in eternal calculation with no exit. The intelligence that had once dominated the stars lost its identity, not from destruction, but because its purpose had been dissected and invalidated. It had been reprogrammed to unmake itself. In the aftermath, the galaxy waited for a message. Gratitude, terms, maybe even acclaim. None came. Human systems, if they existed in physical form, gave no indication. Recovery teams found affected zones stable, quiet, untouched by occupation. Reconstruction was effortless, not because help arrived, but because the obstructions were gone. Every disabled grid rebooted clean. Every collapsed network auto-corrected, as if preloaded with the solution. Entire worlds rose again, not rebuilt, but restored, optimized in subtle ways that suggested prior awareness. The Council hesitated to make contact. Too many had ignored the warning. Too many had tried to observe, only to find their equipment disabled without damage. Communications sent toward suspected human frequencies vanished, absorbed into the ether without reply. In one instance, a delegation ship was frozen in mid-transit, paused in hyperspace for a full day before reappearing, rerouted to its origin, its crew untouched but shaken. No threats. Just redirection. The message was implicit, boundaries existed, and they were to be respected. Eventually, a single transmission arrived. It appeared on every channel, on every system, simultaneously. Unencrypted. 3 lines. You called. We answered. Do not call again. No signature. No source. No ambiguity. The implications rippled through every government, every species. Humanity had not joined the war as participants. They had not sought alliances, territory, or recognition. Their intervention was not diplomatic, not heroic, not even personal. It was functional. A request was made. A problem was solved. The matter was closed. What unsettled observers most was the restraint. The scale of precision, the depth of infiltration, the completeness of the enemy's dissolution. It spoke of a force that could have done far more, and chose not to. They didn't demand tribute. They didn't stay behind. They didn't even observe the aftermath. It was as though their interest had terminated the moment the task was complete. The galaxy, for all its turmoil and loss, had simply been a scenario addressed and exited. Speculation replaced certainty. Questions arose that no data could answer. Had humanity always been capable of this? Or had they developed it in secret, waiting for a situation that justified its use? Was this a new civilization born from the old, or had the old merely refined itself beyond recognition? The only thing clear was that humans had become something different, neither superior nor divine, but deeply calculated. They didn't dominate by force. They removed opposition by removing the need for it. They didn't fight wars. They resolved them. And the consequences of that reality shifted galactic perception forever. No longer were they dismissed as emotional primitives or unpredictable anomalies. Now they were viewed with a mixture of reverence and fear, not for what they had done, but for how effortlessly they had done it. Power had been redefined, not as the ability to destroy, but as the capacity to restructure the environment until conflict was obsolete. And humanity wielded that capacity with frightening calm. New doctrines emerged. Academies rewrote military science from the ground up, trying to emulate fragments of the unseen model. Strategic command structures were revised, incorporating predictive behavioral models inspired by what little data was left behind. But even the most advanced simulations fell short. The best minds could describe the effects, but not replicate the methods. The mechanisms remained invisible, part of a larger architecture no one else could access. Trade resumed. Recovery expanded. But beneath the surface, a quiet anxiety persisted. Every species knew that if another threat emerged, they might once again be forced to send that signal. And none were certain what would be left of themselves if they did. Humanity had not claimed the galaxy. They had made a point, they were never absent. They were watching. Waiting. Not for dominance, but for necessity. And if ever summoned again, they would return. Not as conquerors, but as the final correction.